Lessons for Spiritual Israel. Brother Stephen.
Well, thank you so much, Brother Tim and Brother Bill, for your prayer of encouragement on our behalf. And dear friends, it's just a great privilege to be with you today and tomorrow in this convention. And we've enjoyed visits in the past in person in Grand Rapids, but certainly this is also a wonderful method of meeting together and joining together in fellowship and in meditation one with another. We bring to you the love of your brethren here in Orlando, which we are privileged to meet with, and they've voted on more than one occasion this past week to convey their Christian love. And and we also have a standing privilege of bringing you the warm Christian love of the many distributed workers of the dawn, and from the northeast to the southwest to the northwest, and down here to the southeastern part of the country, and overseas. We have many brethren who are engaged in putting forth the message, the gospel message of the kingdom, and we always desire to bring their love to each and every one of you. We're going to look this afternoon at one of the most interesting experiences of the nation of Israel. In fact, it's one of the early experiences, and it is commented on by the Apostle Paul, believe it or not, in the 11th chapter of Hebrews. You remember, this is the chapter where he gives us the list of many of the faithful ones of old, starting with Abel and Enoch and Noah and Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he mentions, of course, Moses, which we're going to talk about some today and also tomorrow. But in verse 29 of Hebrews, the 11th chapter, he makes an interesting statement just by the use of a pronoun as opposed to a proper name. He says, by faith they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, which the Egyptians, assaying to do, were drowned. Now, what's so interesting about this statement is that he doesn't mention a specific name, but he mentions, in essence, the entire nation of Israel as being included as those who had faith to engage in this, what I think would have been a very difficult thing to do, to cross through a seabed surrounded by walls of water, as we'll talk about, to escape the Egyptian army and to escape Pharaoh. But as Paul says, and as we know, by faith they did this. And so we want to take a look at this experience in a little more detail. And we're going to be spending a lot of time in the 14th chapter of Exodus. So if you have your Bibles with you, you might want to turn to that, although we will refer to other scriptures. But from the historical account, we will be spending most of our time in the 14th chapter of Exodus. And the point in our considering this experience is both to look at it from a historical perspective and what it meant to the Israelites, but even more importantly, what it means to us as spiritual Israelites. And so we're going to focus on that aspect of it in particular. And we know that this experience of natural Israel does have lessons for us, because the Apostle Paul says that it does. In 1 Corinthians, the 10th chapter, verses 1 and 2, the Apostle Paul says, moreover, brethren, I would not that ye should be ignorant how that all our fathers were under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and were all baptized unto Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And then he goes on several more verses following this and goes through a number of the other experiences that the nation of Israel had. And then down in verse 11, he specifically relates it to lessons for us. This is 1 Corinthians 10:11. He says, now all of these things happened unto them for ensamples, or types, pictures, shadows, and they are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world, and we know that really is ages, are come. Well, that includes us, brethren, upon whom the ends of the ages are come. So we want to go back to the book of Exodus, and we're actually going to start with the last two verses of chapter 13, because that's really where this narrative begins. And this is just as they're leaving Egypt and beginning their journey, which we know was going to end up lasting 40 years. The last two verses of Exodus, the 13th chapter, read this way. This is verses 21 and 22. And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of a cloud to lead them in the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, to go by day and night. He took not away the pillar of the cloud by day, nor the pillar of fire by night from before the people. Now, to the nation of Israel, to the Israelites, before they even really began this long journey that they would be on for so many years, he's telling the Israelites that he was going to be with them. He was going to supply them with, he says, a cloud by day. This cloud would lead them, and as the cloud would move, then they would move. We can imagine that even in a natural way, that the cloud by day would help to shield them from the sun and take some of the heat away from them as they traveled. And then at night, he said he would provide a pillar of fire by night, which would lead them as a light when they traveled during the nighttime. We can imagine also that the fire by night might also have warmed them during what were probably some cool desert nights as they traveled. And in these two verses, it is spoken that these were pillars. This wasn't just a puffy cloud or a little bonfire that is being referred to here. These were pillars that were easily seen by the Israelites and conspicuously different than any ordinary cloud or fire. They were, we believe, unmistakable visually to the nation of Israel. Well, we believe that even in this beginning a couple of verses, there is a lesson for us as spiritual Israelites. Before we took the first step in the narrow way, we knew something of God's promise that he would never leave us nor forsake us. This verse has already been quoted this morning, Hebrews 13:5. We also know of that same promise as we enter into every experience of life in the narrow way. One of the lessons that we see in this is that we should not wait until we're in the midst of an experience to claim God's promise to be with us, but to do so at the very beginning, as the Israelites were to look at this cloud and this fire as they began their journey, and as it would be with them throughout it for all of those days and all of those years. In other words, we have this promise as a constant reminder to us before us at each moment of the day, as a pillar of fire, a pillar of a cloud, and thus be better prepared when the experiences of life do come to us. We're reminded of the psalmist's words in Psalm 37, verses 23 to 25, reading from the New Living Translation. The Lord directs the steps of the godly. He delights in every detail of their lives. Though they stumble, they will never fall, for the Lord holds them by the hand. Once I was young, and now I am old, yet I have never seen the godly abandoned or their children begging for bread. Now, as we enter into the next lesson, we want to read the first 9 verses of the 14th chapter of Exodus. And we're going to be reading, most of our quotes will be from the King James, but you can follow along in whatever translation you prefer. The first 9 verses of Exodus 14. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, that they turn and encamp before Pihachiroth, between Migdol and the sea, over against Baal Zephon. Before it ye shall encamp by the sea. For Pharaoh will say of the children of Israel, They are entangled in the land, and the wilderness has shut them in. I will harden Pharaoh's hearts, that he shall follow after them, and I will be honored upon Pharaoh and upon all his host, that the Egyptians may know that I am the Lord. And they did so. And it was told the king of Egypt that the people fled, and the heart of Pharaoh and of his servants was turned against the people, and they said, why have we done this, that we have let Israel go from serving us? And he made ready his chariot and took his people with him. He took 600 chosen chariots, all the chariots of Egypt, and captains over every one of them. And the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued after the children of Israel. And the children of Israel went out with an high hand. But the Egyptians pursued after them, all the horses and chariots of Pharaoh and his horsemen and his army, and overtook them encamping by the sea beside Pihachiroth, before Baal Zephon. With regard to natural Israel experience, these verses are quite clear. Pharaoh had had a change of heart. He was not going to give up, even though it had already cost him the loss of all of the firstborn of Egypt, even of his own house. And in fact, it seems that this experience even made him bolder. He completely disregarded the fact that a higher power than he had brought about the execution of this 10th plague, and that the houses of the Israelites had been spared, but that the Egyptians were not spared. Another important point in these first 9 verses is that God tells Moses in verses 1 through 4 that Pharaoh's heart will again be hardened, and he will chase after the Israelites. We notice that God does this before it actually takes place, or before it is revealed to the Israelites. He tells Moses of this in order to strengthen his faith as Israel's leader, and as this experience unfolds, so that he then can help prepare the faith of the Israelites. Well, as spiritual Israelites, we too are to recognize God's care and protection prior to the experiences that come to us. But we also must remember that our great adversary, like Pharaoh, is not going to give up, even if he has not been successful in stumbling us in the past along a certain line. James, the 4th chapter and verse 7 says that if we resist the devil, he will flee from us. And certainly that may be true as far as a direct attack, perhaps along a certain line, but we know that Satan has many methods, perhaps even more subtle and difficult to recognize than a direct attack. He can use worldly influences. He can use the spirit of the world to direct us down a wrong path. He can, of course, and he does, use our fallen flesh at times to deceive us along various lines. And so the lesson for us is that we always should be on the lookout for Satan's devices, our Pharaoh, so to speak, and not ignore them. Be aware of them, whether it be that of the world, its influences, our weak flesh, or Satan himself. He is not going to give up. Paul said in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 9 and 11, these words: "For to this end also did I write, that I might know the proof of you, whether ye be obedient in all things, lest Satan should get an advantage of us, for we are not ignorant of his devices." Our third lesson from this experience is found in verses 10 through 12 of Exodus 14. "And when Pharaoh drew nigh, the children of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians marched after them, and they were sore afraid. And the children of Israel cried out unto the Lord. And they said unto Moses, Because there were no graves in Egypt, hast thou taken us away to die in the wilderness? Wherefore hast thou dealt with us to carry us forth out of Egypt? Is not this the word that we did tell thee in Egypt, saying, Let us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians? For it had been better for us to serve the Egyptians than that we should die in the wilderness." Now, it's pretty clear to see that at this juncture, Israel's faith was weak. Now, it was going to get stronger because, as we already read earlier, by the time they got to the crossing of the sea itself, their faith had become stronger. But right now, their faith was weak. You know, all that they saw right now was Pharaoh and his approaching army. They even perhaps saw the cloud and the pillar of fire as useless guides, which had perhaps in their minds directed them to a dead end, to the shore of a sea, and even perhaps had even helped the Egyptian hosts to locate them. And so, despite Paul's statement that we read earlier, at this moment, faith was not very much a part of their mindset. But what about us as spiritual Israelites? Can we temporarily, perhaps even momentarily, lose a measure of faith? Can we lose sight of how God has delivered us in the past or his promises to deliver us in the future, and think that somehow or other he has forgotten about us at this moment? Can this cause us to question God, or worse yet, even murmur about our situation, which looks to us to be so bleak, just as the Israelites questioned Moses? Well, you know, surely these things can happen. What's the lesson? Well, the lesson is that we should remember that as long as we are on this side of the veil and our faith is being tested, we will at some times succumb, even if for a moment, to a weakness of faith. Let's keep aware, however, of that, and remember that our faith is not based upon just a momentary slippage. And it's also not to be based on the desire that God must simply take away an experience from us in order for our faith to be stronger. Our faith is to be based upon the sure promises of God that he will always be with us in every experience, and he will overrule all things for our spiritual good. We remember the sentiments of this found in that very familiar verse of Romans 8:28, that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose. Verses 13 and 14 of Exodus, the 14th chapter, provide another lesson for us. Moses said unto the people, "Fear ye not, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will show to you today. For the Egyptians whom ye have seen today, ye shall see them again no more forever. The Lord shall fight for you, and ye shall hold your peace." You know, here we begin to see through Moses' conviction of faith, the gradual strengthening of the faith of the Israelites. Moses here is the example of this. He's telling his beloved Israelites, fellow countrymen, the Lord himself is going to save you. And he says, it's this very day he's going to do this, but it's going to be by his power, not yours and not mine. He says to them, therefore, don't fear, stand still. Perhaps this was a diplomatic way of Moses saying, quit murmuring, stand quietly, and see what happens. The Lord is fighting for you. Hold your peace. The New Living Translation says, just be calm. Now that, I'm sure, was easier to say than to be, but that was the admonition from God to Moses, through Moses to the nation of Israel. Well, for us, we know that in certain experiences, we may reach the point where there seems to be no solution or escape to what we're going through. In these times especially, we need to claim the conviction of our faith just as Moses did. This is spoken of by Paul as part of his definition of faith found in the 11th chapter of Hebrews, the first verse, where he says, faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. And this word evidence really means conviction, the conviction of things not seen. In experiences where we just cannot see with our own eyes the solution or the path to take, things not seen. Mature faith will have the conviction in God's overruling in those matters, even though we can't see them, we can't see the outcome. However, we must stand still. We must quiet ourselves and wait with a spiritual calmness, but with alertness for the Lord's leading. That is faith's conviction in things not seen. We're reminded of this by some words that Jeremiah spoke. He was given a very difficult commission to speak concerning the unfaithfulness and the coming captivity of Israel. He lamented and wept about this greatly because he loved his nation. And he knew that there was no way out for them at that time. But he also had conviction in the promises of God that a better day would come for Israel in the future. His attitude is well expressed in Lamentations, the 3rd chapter and verse 26, which provides a formula that we should follow when confronted with experiences where there seems to be no way out. He says, Lamentations 3:26, it is good that a man should both hope and quietly wait for the salvation or deliverance of the Lord. You always see two words here, two key words, hope and quietly wait. Hope here means an expectant hope, not a fanciful hope, but one that is based upon the promises and the statements of the scriptures. And yet we cannot truly expect God's deliverance unless we are quietly submissive and wait for his leading and his direction. They both work hand in hand. And so the lesson for us is, as it was with the Israelites, let us hope and quietly wait for the Lord's deliverance. In verses 15 and 16 of Exodus, the 14th chapter, we find another lesson. And the Lord said unto Moses, wherefore criest unto me? Speak unto the children of Israel that they go forward. But lift thou up thy rod, and stretch out thy hand over the sea, and divide it, and the children of Israel shall go on dry ground through the midst of the sea. Now, for natural Israel, these words of verse 15 seem contradictory to the words that we just considered in verse 13 to stand still. Now he tells them to go forward. Well, I think the thought is this. In verse 13, the standing still is mentioned with reference to seeing the salvation or the deliverance of the Lord. Only he could accomplish that. However, in verse 15, God tells Moses to instruct the people that they must do something also. And what was that? They must go forward. The Strong's Dictionary defines this phrase, go forward, with a very interesting phrase that is just beautifully connected to the situation that the Israelites were in. Strong's defines this phrase, go forward, as pull up the tent pins. Pull up the tent pins. For Israel, this was literal, because they were gathered there, camped together on the shore of the Red Sea, and in order for them to move forward, they were going to have to pull up camp. They were going to have to break camp. And so what God through Moses is telling them is, we're about to resume this journey. Pull up the tent pins, pull up stakes, get your families ready, get your cattle ready, and all of this, because we're going to be moving forward. Moses is telling them to get ready, And that was their responsibility, their job. And he also tells Moses in verse 16 what he has to do, what he is to do as God's instrument. He says, lift up the rod, which was a representation of God's power and authority. Stretch it out over the sea. The waters will divide, and then the children of Israel, having prepared themselves, having pulled up stakes, so to speak, will be then able to proceed forward on dry ground. Both were required. And isn't that true with us too? You know, the Apostle Paul in Philippians chapter 2, verses 12 and 13 says, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God which worketh in you both to will and to do of his good pleasure. Paul is saying we must work, and God works in us. And notice that Paul mentions our part first. Now that perhaps might seem unusual, because our part is probably very small compared to what God is doing for us. But yet God's work in us can't be effective unless we first are committed to working with him. And what does that require? It requires that we pull up, as it were, our earthly stakes, our earthly tent pins, our earthly aims, our preferences, our ambitions, so that we are prepared to go forward into we'll say, the Red Sea of experiences and the ultimate deliverance, which God's overruling hand will provide. Just as it was with the Israelites, if they had not at first made themselves ready by packing up their personal things, their deliverance by God could not have happened. Jesus made a very simple but important statement recorded in John, the 5th chapter, and verse 17. He says, my Father worketh hitherto, and I work. Let us have this same attitude in our experiences. And remember also that the many times that our part of the work is to break free, as it were, from the fleshly propensities, the fleshly thinking, the fleshly tent pins of our mind or of our character, so that we stand ready to follow the Lord's leadings through the sea of experience which may be before us. In verses 17 to 19 of Exodus 14, we continue our lesson. And I, behold, this is God speaking to Moses, I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians, and they shall follow them. And I will get me honor upon Pharaoh and upon all his hosts and upon his chariots and upon his horsemen. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, when I have gotten my honor upon Pharaoh, upon his chariots and his horsemen. And the angel of God, which went before the camp of Israel, removed and went behind them. And the pillar of the cloud went from before their face and stood before them. Went from before their face and stood behind them. Here God tells Moses that even though he is going to miraculously divide the waters so that the people can pass through, he's also going to allow the Egyptians to follow, but only up to a point, and for the eventual purpose of bringing about their destruction and Israel's deliverance. And to provide evidence of the limitation of Pharaoh's pursuit, God says that he's going to have an angel or a messenger in the form of the pillar of the cloud now go from in front of the Israelites. Now that will go behind them and will be a barrier between them, a protective barrier between them and the Egyptians. The lesson for God's consecrated people at the present time is that God will allow Satan to tempt us or even to pursue after us in an experience. But just as he did with his servant Job, God will set a limitation. And furthermore, such a limitation God himself will set as a barrier, a protective barrier between us and Satan, so that no harm can come to the new creature. We recall Peter's words in 1 Peter, the 3rd chapter, verses 12 and 13. For the eyes of the Lord are over the righteous, and his ears are open unto their prayers. But the face of the Lord is against them that do evil. And who is he that will harm you, if ye be followers of that which is good? Our next lesson is found in verses 20 to 22. And it, that is this angel in the form of the cloud, came between the camp of the Egyptians and the camp of Israel. And it was a cloud and darkness to them, that is to the Egyptians, but it gave light by night to these, the Israelites, so that the one came not near the other all the night. And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night, and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. And the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea upon dry ground, and the waters were a wall unto them on their right hand and on their left. You know, there's some very interesting points mentioned in these verses. We see first that God is telling Moses that not only is he going to place this cloud between Israel and the Egyptians, he's going to go a couple of steps further. To the Egyptians, the cloud is going to create much darkness, but to the Israelites, it will give light. How could this be possible? You know, we remember that the cloud was not in the sky above them, but it was in the form of a pillar behind them, which meant that the Israelites were walking away from that cloud, you know, kind of like walking away from a fog bank or a foggy highway, whereas the Egyptians were walking right into it and wouldn't be able to see. And that fire, which was still before them, the pillar of the fire, was still a light to them to lead the Israelites. And so they were in the light, whereas the Egyptians were walking right into darkness. Another point from the narratives is the clear statement that the Lord caused the sea to go back and the waters to divide. You know, we're not told, and we don't know exactly how God did this, and there's been many things suggested. But we do know that it was a miracle of God, because the account says that the Lord caused the sea to go back. And that's really all that we need to know, that he did it. It was his power. One last point in the narrative. In verse 22, it says that the waters that were initially the very barrier to them going any further, the seashore there, the Red Sea, now was a wall of protection, both on the right side and on the left side. So as we picture the Israelites going through the Red Sea, they're protected on the right and left by a wall of water. They're protected in the rear by the pillar of the cloud, and then they're guided in the front by the pillar of fire, which also gave them light. All of this being orchestrated by the Heavenly Father. And so truly we can understand what Paul meant when he said, as we read earlier, that the Israelites were baptized in the cloud and in the sea. Well, like Israel, we are walking in a nighttime of darkness in the world around us. Even in our own experiences, perhaps according to the flesh, they may seem dark, cloudy, dreary. But we are walking in the light of God's countenance, of his favor. His word, we are told, is a lamp unto our feet and a light unto our path. And as long as we follow that light, that pillar that's in front of us, and move forward, we know that through his overruling and his direction, ultimate victory can be attained. He will direct every stormy sea of trouble, our Red Sea experiences, just as he did for Israel. And the very experiences, the water that seems so troubling to us, perhaps at first, actually can even become a wall of protection for us, from the great adversary, just as the wall of water was a protection to the Israelites. No trial has assailed us, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10:13 from the Diaglott, except what belongs to man. And God is faithful, who will not permit you to be tried beyond your ability, but will with the trial also direct the issue that you may be able to bear it. verses 23 through 28 of Exodus 14 give us these words. And the Egyptians pursued and went in after them to the midst of the sea, even all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, his horsemen. And it came to pass that in the morning watch, the Lord looked unto the host of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and of the cloud, and troubled the host of the Egyptians, and took off their chariot wheels, that they drave them heavily. So that the Egyptians said, let us flee from the face of Israel, for the Lord fighteth for them against the Egyptians. And the Lord said to Moses, stretch out thine hand over the sea, that the waters may come again upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots, upon their horsemen. And Moses stretched forth his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to his strength when the morning appeared. And the Egyptians fled against it, and the Lord overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen and all the hosts of Pharaoh that came into the sea after them. There remained not so much as one of them. Well, we could just sum up these words by the statement, God utterly overthrew Pharaoh and his hosts. We note that in verse 24, God mentions, or the account mentions, the morning watch. This was just before sunrise, when the first rays of light were beginning to shine. And it was at this time, when the Israelites were now safely on the other side, that the hosts of the Egyptians were destroyed. And they saw that because it was now morning. You know, for us, we see a couple of lessons. First, dispensationally, we know that once the church is complete and all of the 144,000 are safely beyond the veil, on the other side, we'll say, of the Red Sea of experience, God, through his Son, will make quick work of completing the overthrow of Satan's world and of binding him so that he can deceive the nations no more. But then, how true it will be, as Malachi 4 verse 2 says, that the Son of Righteousness will arise with healing in his wings. Darkness will give way to the morning of a new day. But there's also a daily application to the consecrated at the present time. You know, for each one of us, in our valley or nighttime experiences in this Red Sea of turmoil that we are currently going through, God will give us victories and deal defeats to Satan if we humbly and obediently follow the divine directions and the light of God's leading. In Isaiah 33 verse 2, we find a wonderful promise concerning God's daily deliverance of his people. And we're going to read this from the Amplified translation. Isaiah 33:2. O Lord, be gracious to us. We have waited expectantly for you. Be the arm of your servants every morning, their strength and their defense, our salvation also in the time of trouble. Our last lesson from Exodus 14 is the last 3 verses of this chapter. But the children of Israel walked upon dry ground walked upon dry land in the midst of the sea, and the waters were a wall unto them on their right hand and on their left. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day out of the hand of the Egyptians. And Israel saw the Egyptians dead upon the seashore. And Israel saw that great work which the Lord did upon the Egyptians, and the people feared the Lord, reverenced the Lord, and believed the Lord and his servant Moses. You know, it's evident from these verses of the happy ending to this story, the happy ending of Israel's faith. They did learn to have faith in this experience, and they rejoiced. You know, it's just, when we look back on it, it's too bad that, you know, when they started walking into the wilderness shortly thereafter, they kind of fell back into their old ways again of losing faith. But at this moment, in this experience, their faith gained a great victory. And so Paul could say, by faith, they passed through the Red Sea. Will that be said of us, dear brethren? You know, if we are faithful unto death and attain the crown of life, we will most certainly be able to look back and see the great work which the Lord has done in us and for us. But even now, as we see God's delivering hand from experience to experience, from test to test, from trial to trial, our reverence for him and our faith in him becomes stronger, preparing us for both our future experiences on this side of the veil, which may come and will come, but also preparing us for an eternity of service to God and his Son, the greater Moses and deliverer, not only of us, but of all mankind. You know, as the words of the hymn say, then I'll see what thou hast wrought. Then I'll love thee as I ought. Looking back, I'll praise the way thou hast led me day by day. You know, for a final thought, chapter 15, and we're not going to read it because we're out of time. Chapter 15 of Exodus is an epilogue. It's beautiful. It's the song that Moses sang along with all the children of Israel of praise to God for his deliverance through the Red Sea. And we as spiritual also have a song to sing. It's referred to as the Song of Moses, but there's something added to it. You recall in Revelation 15, verses 2 through 4, it is called the Song of Moses and the Song of the Lamb. We sing it prospectively now, but in its fullness, we will sing it beyond the veil. And we'd like to close with the reading of those three verses, Revelation 15, 2 through 4. And I saw, as it were, this is John speaking, a sea of glass mingled with fire, and them that had gotten the victory over the beast, over his image, and over his mark, and over the number of his name, stand on the sea of glass, having the harps of God. And they sing the song of Moses, the servant of God, and the song of the Lamb, saying, great and marvelous are thy works, O Lord God Almighty. Just and true are thy ways, thou King of saints. Who shall not fear thee, O Lord, and glorify thy name? For thou only art holy. And then notice the beautiful words that John adds. For then all nations, not just the church, all nations shall come and worship before thee, for thy judgments will be made manifest. Dear brethren, may we be faithful in our daily Red Sea experiences, even unto death, so that we can sing this song both now and forever. And may the Lord add his blessing.